Viewpoints on the talk station, FM 107, AM 1240. Well, starting this week, we've been doing a series of interviews of book authors, and we've got one today, our guest, Judge Douglas McCullough. And he is the author of Sea of Greed, a book that has very interesting local connections, and both the author and others will be present at the Maritime Museum tomorrow evening in Beaufort, starting at 5:30. And with that, Judge, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us.
Good afternoon. I'm glad to be here.
This is an interesting story. Sea of Greed. I remember the story appearing in the Carteret County News-Times. As I recall, it was a shrimp vessel, a shrimper, that was brought to the docks. It had a fair amount of interesting product on board, and wasn't all shrimp, as a matter of fact. So let's start with that story and how you got involved.
The Coast Guard from Fort Macon were on routine patrol, two Coast Guardsmen with law enforcement duties, the evening of July the 2nd, 1982, and it was over the 4th of July weekend. They saw two boats, one smaller than the other, a little runabout type, and they were out of the channel. And so the Coast Guard first went toward rendering assistance. As it ended up being more suspicious, and they pursued the larger of the vessels, which was a shrimper, they ended up finding 29,000 pounds of marijuana. So you said a fair amount. That's a fair amount.
They then escorted the vessel to the Moore City State Port, as I recall.
Well, that's where the guys who were on the boat abandoned it. They had actually encountered these individuals at the fuel docks near the port. Okay. And they had gone on board. One of the Coast Guardsmen had gone on board, saw very suspicious radio equipment that was designed for communicating a lot further than most shrimpers do, and also a map that showed a track line coming from Columbia to Morehead City, Columbia the country, and heard a shotgun rack around behind him. So he talked his way off the boat, and in that era they didn't have secure communications, so they had to go down the waterfront till they could find a payphone to call for assistance. When they called for assistance, the bad guys moved the boat from the fuel docks to the state port, tied it up, and abandoned the ship. And so the first chapter of my book is called Abandoned Lady, because the boat was, the real name of the boat was the Lady Morissette. They had a false name on the stern called the Bobby M., but when we actually looked inside the boat where they post on the mast the true name and identity and serial number of the boat, it was the Lady Morissette from Louisiana.
Now, this is an interesting, let's start with this aspect of it. This Coast Guardsman was looking aboard the vessel, ostensibly to see if they needed aid, and he asked, I guess, had permission to come aboard. And you said something a moment ago that really was very intriguing. Racked, I heard a shotgun behind him, racked. In other words, basically, they chambered a shell. That's
correct. I mean, if you've ever heard a pump shotgun in your life, you will recognize that sound forever.
The Coast Guardsman just simply said, well, I see there's nothing here, and got off the vessel and went down the street and got a payphone.
And you had to use a payphone because he could tell from the sophisticated radio equipment that they could monitor his radio traffic, and he didn't want them to know that they were calling in assistance.
And then the traffic, the assistance. What did the assistance amount to? Was it
the Coast Guard mounted a response team from Fort Macon that came over by boat, because at this point they didn't really know what they had, and they waited to board the vessel. First, they had to find it, and they found it pretty quickly. It was at the state port, tied up by the nose, a way that no waterman would tie a boat up of that size.
And the crew had abandoned it.
And the crew had abandoned it because the crew figured that they had been caught.
The book, by the way, is Sea of Greed, and our guest, Judge Douglas McCullough, and he is, as a matter of fact, the author, but also, what caught your attention about this story in your judicial capacity?
Well, I was the prosecutor on the case. I was a federal prosecutor from 1981 to 1996 in the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I was the senior assistant in the U.S. Attorney's Office, called the first assistant. And so I got to choose the cases that I took, and when this big smuggling vessel came in, I was contacted about the prosecution and investigation of it, and so I directed the investigation, and then ultimately led to the prosecution of 120-some people in this case, including the Mayor Pro Tem of Atlantic Beach, Gary Walters, and some other local individuals who were involved in different aspects of this community.
Let's talk about the little background on the vessel itself. It was ostensibly a mothership. Is that correct?
Well, this was a shrimp vessel. It carried the marijuana all the way from Columbia up to here. Their actual destination was in the Back Creek area. This particular vessel never made it that far. What was really interesting about this vessel is after they got it from the co-conspirators who provided the vessel down in Louisiana, they took it to Brownsville, Texas, and they refrigerated the hold of that ship at no small expense. And the reason they did that is they knew the Coast Guard overflies with sensors that can detect heat or detect if your ship has cold items in storage, so that their heat signature will register on their forward-looking infrared radar differently if they're just running pot, because then you'd have red-hot vegetable material.
Right.
So they put the pot in air-conditioned comfort for the ride from Columbia here, so in case the Coast Guard flew over, they would look like a shrimper.
Now, it is interesting. You mentioned, and I know some of the individuals that were associated locally. You mentioned the Mayor Pro Tem of Atlantic Beach was involved in this. What was their participation? Were they simply a distribution point?
No, the mayor's real value, he had two values to the conspirators. One, he serviced the police cars for the town of Atlantic Beach at a service station, so they could monitor the radio traffic and get the frequencies of all the different law enforcement agencies in the area and keep track of where all the cars were. That was very valuable because there's a point of vulnerability when the trucks emerge from the woods onto the road. They don't want to be seeing a police car right there on that stretch of the road.
Right.
But after the trucks get on the road, they're pretty innocuous.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Very common to see, particularly at that day and age, people from foreign cities like Detroit, Chicago, Pittsburgh coming down to this area and picking up seafood and hauling it back.
Right.
And so they needed to know where the police were, and he could supply that. More importantly, he was the custodian for a hunt club that leased land on the Weyerhaeuser property that came into Back Creek, and he had the keys to the gates that blocked those roads, so they could get a tractor trailer right down to the water's edge through his assistance.
Were there any other local folks involved?
There were several. There was a Stephen Fadry who had just started the Net House restaurant,
mm-hmm.
and the day after the boat was abandoned at the state port, Fadry fled town, and his employees showed up to find a locked restaurant and no owner.
Right.
And his sister, I believe, had to come down from Baltimore with her husband, who was a longshoreman, and they ran that restaurant for 25 years.
Exactly. Were there others?
There was Bobby Webb, who's a trainer,
right.
a physical trainer, John Van Horn, who used to own the Ice House
right.
restaurant, a few other people, but not many. Most of these people were, and all of the heads of the organization were from out of town.
When you say out of town, where are we talking about? Columbia?
One was from the Grand Caymans, and one was from Houston, Texas, and the other one was from Detroit.
We're going to find out how big a story this is, because it does eventually involve was he president of Panama?
I think that was his title.
He also carried the military title of general, as I recall, General
Yes.
Noriega. This is an interesting story, and one that has tremendous depth. And I might add, we've got to talk about this, international issues as well.
It does. I'm at the operational level. I investigate and prosecute as a prosecutor.
Mm-hmm.
Now, sometimes when it leads to the head of state of a foreign country, that's a little bit above my pay grade, and I just can't go after somebody like that. Decisions have to be made at the very top. And what happened in this particular case is that load, the Lady Morissette load that was seized by the Coast Guard, was the last one that these folks lost to law enforcement. They ran another one right here in Morehead City, 39,000 pounds, up to the Back Creek area, unloaded it. They bought some shrimp, and they stacked shrimp at the back of the truck so that if they were inspected, it would look like they had come with shrimp. They had manifests that showed they were hauling shrimp as they passed through weigh stations on their way to Detroit. Then they did a 600,000-pound load up the Mississippi River on an ocean-going barge, and about a dozen airplane flights of 10,000 pounds each. This amassed the ringleaders $50 million in cash, which would be like 500 today. And they had that in a house in Tampa and no place to put it until they hooked up with Noriega and laundered it into Panama.
We were talking about the 25,000 pounds, as I recall?
29,000, 4,000.
Okay, 29,000.
You're in the ballpark.
29,000 pounds of marijuana. What was the street value back in 1982?
Oh, it was in the millions. I don't remember the exact amount, but that would be worth probably about $8 to $10 million in street value back then. If your listeners are interested, I can tell you what the pay scale was back then for workers. Smuggling is a manpower intensive. So and just like work in real life, the people who do the hardest work get paid the least. So the bale chunkers, the ones who actually take the 50-pound bales from the ship and lug it to wherever the truck is parked in the woods, got paid about $10,000 for their night's work. The boat crew who went to Colombia got $25,000, and the boat captain would get an extra $10,000, so he made about $35,000. The lookouts and guards and security people made about $25,000. The director of security made $50,000. The guy who was the accountant made $500,000, who kept track of the money, and then all the rest was left for the ringleaders. And that's how they amassed, after 2 or 3 loads, they amassed that $50 million.
Our guest again, Judge Douglas McCullough, and again, the book is Sea of Greed. And just to remind you, tomorrow evening, Wednesday evening, at the Maritime Museum in Beaufort, he will be giving a presentation on this, and you're going to have who else in attendance starting at?
We're going to have a huge crowd of law enforcement people. The sector commander for Sector North Carolina is coming up from Wilmington for the Coast Guard, accompanied by his deputy. Sheriff Asa Buck is going to be there. The chiefs of police of all the towns in Carteret County and their mayors have been invited to attend, and I'm going to disclose investigative information that never really made it into the book, or some things that are just mentioned obliquely in the book, but I'm going to give credit to the local police departments that contributed to the overall investigation and made the case stronger, even at the time of the incident with the Lady Marcette, although we couldn't prove it in court for years.
I'm curious, related to the local participants in this case, how did they get involved in this?
Quite by accident. Stephen Fodry was in Atlanta in a nightclub, and he watched a young man who had a whole lot of cash, wearing jewelry like Rolex watches and gold chains, and he was plying all the girls with champagne and just really playing the role. And Fodry just surmised that this person might be a smuggler, and he approached him, and they felt each other out for a bit. And then eventually Fodry told him, I have a place that would be a great offload site.
Wow.
And that's how they ended up coming here.
And had they had more than one offload?
There were actually 2 loads in North Carolina, one that was seized and one that was successful that we did not catch.
All right. And what's interesting is the ringleaders in this are not friendly people.
No, though. Well, one of the guys was pretty violent because he ended up having a man shot.
Right, and I'm just thinking, did the local players fully comprehend the potential here?
I think that they realized that they were into a serious organization, and that they knew that what they were doing had real consequences.
And then I'm looking at, by the way, a cover of Time magazine. And it's, of course, Manuel Noriega, and it's Panama's Noriega proves they're a law unto themselves, the drug thugs. So this is a result of your investigation that leads to this?
Well, yes. Eventually, one of the ringleaders was a man named Stephen Kalish. He was pretty much in charge of the logistics of getting the marijuana moved from Colombia to the offload sites in this country. He controlled the offload crew, and they would come into town here. They rented beach cottages at Emerald Isle, local motel rooms. They told their neighbors that they were a construction crew that had brought the job in early, and their boss had rewarded them with time at the beach. And that was their story, and that's why they were out every day fishing. But actually, their fishing was a cover for surveillance on the Coast Guard station and to see what kind of water patrols we had, marine fisheries and other law enforcement. This group eventually disintegrated after that man was shot. He didn't die. I guess God protects drunks because he was dead drunk. The blast from the shotgun did not kill him. He crawled and to the phone and got 911, and he eventually became our witness. He decided being with us under immunity was better than taking his chances. So he provided the key witness that we needed to link everything together. Kalish was under investigation in Tampa and here. We had a pretty serious turf war with Tampa, just like you see on TV. They looked at Eastern North Carolina as the hick kid from the country, and I had to fight to keep control of my investigation. I took Kalish out to Camp Lejeune, and the provost marshal provided security for me. We went out in February of 86, 87, and Kalish was interviewed by the FBI, DEA, and Customs jointly. So we had 3 different reporting agencies, and each agent wrote up his report of interview and attached the corroborative information that Kalish had, such as airplane logs showing Noriega flying around in Kalish's airplane. Wow. Even went to D.C. to meet with Reagan, and Noriega was in Kalish's plane and landed at Andrews Air Force Base. So those reports went up.
All right, let's talk here for a moment. The event actually took place in 1982.
1982.
When did you conclude the case?
Well, the prosecutions went on through 89, but we indicted the case in 86, 4 years later.
What took so long?
We didn't have any witnesses. All we had were ghosts.
So you needed that.
I needed a witness.
All
and
right.
The shooting incident took place in 85, and that led to the indictments in 86.
And then, of course, that included the indictments of the local folks as well.
Oh, yes.
All right. And did that take place about 85, 86?
The indictments took place in 86. I don't remember the exact month right now.
Our guest, Judge Douglas McCullough, and I care to mention Judge, he's an appellate court judge now. And the book is Sea of Greed, and the program we're talking about is tomorrow evening, Wednesday evening, at the North Carolina Maritime Museum in Beaufort. And by the way, is this open to the public? It
is open to the public, and we would love to have them come. After the event is over, there will be books there for me to sign and personalize, and it's a great time to buy those Christmas presents early.
I want to go back to something here before we wrap things up, because I think the story related to Noriega is important. You've said that actually things began to unravel for the president of Panama at the time. About 1986, he visited with President Reagan. Was Reagan aware? Was the administration aware of any nature of his drug activity?
I'm not sure of what people at that level were aware of. I know that I've talked to intelligence officers in my capacity as a Marine intelligence officer myself in the reserves, and they did not seem to be aware that Noriega was, in the parlance of the street, dirty. They knew he wasn't totally clean. His reputation was that of a man that could not be bought but could be rented from time to time.
Right.
And so they used him as an asset against Castro, because he was able to converse with Castro and then bring back intelligence. And he had given up some low-level drug rings that operated in Panama from time to time. One of the reasons he actually flew to D.C. was to receive an award from DEA for his cooperation.
The irony of it all. And then, of course, this became an issue with the eventual invasion of Panama.
It did. What happened with those reports that I mentioned, I had each agency, FBI, DEA, and Customs. They each did their own report of interview, and it went up through their chain to their national headquarters. Now we have 3 reports, 3 different federal agencies. The word is beginning to spread. Noriega cannot be dealt with or trusted in the way that they had before, because now I've got a high school dropout from Houston who has definite evidence that he has laundered money into Panama with Noriega's personal assistance. That was just more than anybody could take at that level. So it had to go to the National Security Council to make a decision. The reason I know that is I got this very cryptic phone call one morning, and said, be in Washington at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning, report to the Executive Office of U.S. Attorneys. That's the office that administers all of us U.S. attorneys around the country. So I don't know if right now, if I'm in trouble, or if I'm going to be given a pat on the back, or if they're going to issue some sort of instructions to me. I fly up, go to the office. They say, go down to the criminal division. I go to the Assistant Attorney General Criminal Division's offices. They take me to a conference room. And there my buddies from Tampa are in there drinking coffee and having, with Washington Post is on the table. And it's a very tense moment because they're not really my friends. You know, they're the ones who tried to preclude me from investigating, and we're all in one conference room wondering what the devil is going on. Late morning, about 11:30, 11:45, just before lunch, I've been sitting there now an hour and a half or so, the Assistant Attorney General of the Criminal Division himself, Stephen Trott, who is a retired Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals judge for the federal judge. He was the Assistant Attorney General back then. He came in and said, it went to the National Security Council this morning, and Reagan said, if he's dirty, indict him. He said, the indictment of Manuel Noriega will take place. Miami is going to be the place of prosecution. You both are ordered to get all of your materials together and be ready for the prosecution team to come and pick all this stuff up. So the two witnesses that I developed against Noriega were the first two non-Hispanics to implicate him with corroborative evidence, and that's what pushed that investigation and prosecution.
The book, Sea of Greed, the author, Judge Douglas McCullough, our guest this afternoon. He will be in attendance at this function tomorrow evening at the Maritime Museum in Beaufort, starting at 5:30 in the afternoon.
5:30 in the afternoon, and we hope the public program will last about an hour. We're going to have some comments from myself, the sector commander for the Coast Guard, Captain Murtaugh, and a retired federal judge who handled the civil forfeiture of the Lady Marset, the shrimper in question, and some of the law enforcement personnel who were involved. And then I'll be commending some of the local police departments for the way they cooperated in the investigation.
Many of the police officers that were involved are probably no longer with us.
Correct. They have probably retired or whatever, but I'm just going to commend the department through their current representative.
Tomorrow evening, Wednesday, at the North Carolina Maritime Museum on Front Street in Beaufort, opportunity for the public to meet our guest this afternoon, Judge Douglas McCullough, but also the opportunity to hear more details than we've been given this afternoon. Judge, as always, thank you very much for being with us.
I have certainly enjoyed it. Thank you.
Viewpoints on the talk station, FM 107, AM 1240.